pour the coffee? No one's home? Not because they left, but because their need for you did. The calendar is empty. The silence is clean. No demands, no plans. Just you in a morning that doesn't belong to anyone else. You sit down, and for the first time in decades, you feel time pressing inward, not forward, not a rush, not a deadline, just a strange, weightless stillness. And in that stillness, a thought appears, not loud, just steady. What if you didn't have to stay? You look back, and it feels like watching someone else's life. Predictable, efficient, safe. You were always moving, always organizing, always anticipating what others needed before they said it. You didn't avoid yourself. You just folded her into everyone else's plans. You called it partnership. You called it purpose. You even called it love. But what it really was performance. You celebrated your sacrifices. You labeled them maturity. You told yourself the joy would come later after the work, after the roles, after you'd earned it. Now, the after has arrived, and it doesn't feel like a reward. It feels like a room you built but never entered. You thought the quiet would feel restful, but it doesn't. It feels like a house with all the furniture removed, a structure without weight. You try to relax, but your body only knows how to serve. You try to dream, but you only know how to plan. You try to want, but desire doesn't land when you've spent your life scanning others for permission. There's no crisis, no breakdown. Just a slow, spreading awareness that you were never taught how to belong to yourself. You know how to be needed. You know how to be depended on. But you don't know how to move when no one is watching. You thought you'd feel free. Instead, you feel unassigned. You have everything you said you wanted. The calm, the time, the open space, but nothing about it feels familiar. Because you never rehearsed what it would mean to want something that didn't serve someone else. This didn't start now. It started the first time you called your own longing unreasonable, disruptive, too much. And now, you sit in the after and realize you were never waiting for the right time. You were waiting for permission from a version of life that never planned to give it. You were raised on quiet. Not the peaceful kind, the obedient kind. You learned that restraint meant respect, that staying was strength, that needing less made you more admirable. You watched the women around you shrink for stability. Not because they were weak, but because they believed that safety was earned through endurance. You inherited that belief. You wore it like armor. And every time you had the urge to break pattern, you remembered what you were taught. Don't make it about you. Don't want too loudly. Don't risk the structure just because something inside you feels unfinished. So you became fluent in self-containment. You held your tongue. You softened your ambition. You traded curiosity for consistency. At first, it worked. You were trusted, respected, depended on, but not seen. Not really. You stopped checking the door because you assumed it wasn't meant to open for someone like you. Even now, the idea of leaving at 60 feels like betrayal. Not of the marriage, not of the family, but of the story. The story where endurance is virtue and disruption is shame. You ask yourself, do I even have the right to want more after so many years of having enough? What once protected you is now quietly limiting you. You've spent a lifetime mastering how to stay, but no one ever taught you how to go. Now you stand at the edge of your own life and realize you don't need to be trapped to feel stuck. Sometimes the cage isn't made of walls. It's made of praise, of tradition, of a loyalty that asks for your silence in exchange for your place. And until now, you believed that was the only way to belong. You didn't belong automatically. You belonged by earning it, by being reliable, by staying agreeable, by becoming the person who never needed much but gave everything. You weren't just loved, you were useful, and usefulness became your identity. You translated tension before it exploded. You kept schedules no one else noticed. You remember details others forgot. And when things felt hard, you absorbed it. That's how you kept your place, not by being loud, but by being essential in quiet ways. So when you imagine leaving or changing or even wanting more, it feels like breaking a contract you never signed, but always upheld. Because if you're no longer needed, who are you? If you're no longer holding it all together, what's left for you to hold? This is why leaving now feels more radical than it would have at 30. Because now, you're not just stepping away from a life, you're stepping away from an identity you've been reinforcing for decades. They will say you've changed, that you're being impulsive, that you used to be so grounded. But the truth is, you just stopped performing. And performance was the price of your place. You're not becoming someone new. You're just not working for the applause anymore. George Eliot once said, "It's never too late to be what you might have been." It sounds romantic until you realize what it asks of you. Because no one talks about how disruptive it is to begin when everyone else thinks you should be winding down. You thought you were building a life. You were building a role. And now, you want to live without one. But living without a role means being seen for who you are when you're not being useful. That's not freedom. At first, it feels like exposure. And yet, something in you knows you can't go back to being someone who only existed in service. You told yourself there would be time. Time to travel. Time to rest. Time to come back to yourself. But each year folded into the next with small compromises. Later, not now. Just until things settle. And things never really did. They just rearranged around everyone else's needs. So you kept waiting. Not for the right moment, but for the right feeling, a kind of permission to want something that didn't fit the narrative. But no one gives you that permission. Not at 30, not at 60, not ever. Especially not when the life you built looks functional on the outside. You thought if you waited long enough, desire would soften into contentment. But it didn't. It calcified. And now, it presses from the inside with questions you can't unhear. This is the full system you inherited: restraint. You earned belonging through sacrifice, and you postponed your own becoming so long. It began to feel indulgent to even consider. You stayed small so everything else could stay intact. Now the walls are still standing and you're the one who's disappeared. You didn't stay too long. You stayed exactly as long as it took to forget you were allowed to want more. And when you finally touched the door not to leave, just to see, you realized something no one ever told you. It was never locked. It looked like duty. It looked like pride. It looked like love. But it was habit and fear and a timeline you never chose. What feels radical now isn't the act of leaving. It's the realization that nothing was stopping you except the version of you that believed freedom had an expiration date. Moment number 1. Recognition. You weren't afraid to leave. You were afraid of what it meant about everything you stayed for. Because if you can walk away now after decades, what does that say about the life you protected? You begin replaying it, not with judgment, but with a kind of suspended breath. The holidays you planned, the arguments you diffused, the years you filled with tasks because longing felt too risky. It wasn't fake. It just wasn't yours. You were living a life that worked. But working and belonging aren't the same. You belong to the rhythm, not to yourself. And now that the rhythm is gone, you feel the emptiness underneath the routine you mastered. It doesn't feel like regret. It feels like exposure, like someone turned on the lights in a room you didn't know you'd been sleeping in. Moment number 2, exposure. You didn't wait because you were loyal. You waited because you thought freedom had rules, that it had to be earned, that it came with a timestamp that passed a certain age. Wanting more made you ungrateful. You rehearsed contentment until it became convincing, even to you. And now, standing at the edge of something new, you feel disoriented, not because it's too late, but because no one ever told you you were allowed to start this late. You look at the years you stayed, not because you had to, but because you didn't know you could leave without breaking everything. But the rupture never came. Only the quiet. Only the unsettling possibility that you could have chosen this sooner. You're not angry. You're not ashamed. You're just awake to how long you postponed becoming. You kept thinking time would give you permission. But time doesn't grant that. You do. And now, you finally have it. Not because everything is in place, but because you're done waiting for the feeling of being allowed. You didn't leave late. You left when the performance could no longer hold your weight, not the weight of obligation, the weight of truth. Because the life you lived, the one they admired, was held together by patterns you no longer agreed to. You didn't run. You stepped back and saw yourself clearly for the first time. Not as a role, not as a provider, not as a container for everyone else's comfort. Just a person, with needs that didn't expire, with questions that didn't soften, with desire that didn't care about timing. You were not wrong for staying. You were practiced. And now, you're unpracticed, clumsy with your own freedom, awkward with possibility, but real in a way you haven't been in years. You thought you had to become someone new. But you didn't. You just stopped editing yourself to be recognizable. This is not reinvention. It's reclamation of the version of you that always sat underneath the version everyone preferred. You were always in there, waiting for the script to end. It's not too late to become yourself. It's just the first time no one's clapping for it. No praise, no applause. Just quiet certainty that you can move without asking if it's allowed. You don't need to be explained. You don't need to be understood. You're not rebelling. You're returning. Not to the past, but to the version of you that no longer needs to perform usefulness to justify her existence. You didn't miss your moment. You missed the part where someone told you you didn't need permission to begin. You inherited a script that ended at quiet survival. You were supposed to be grateful for stability, not hungry for change, not curious about yourself. But now the story has run out. And what's left isn't failure. It's space, an unassigned future with no lines to memorize. They'll call it a late awakening. You'll know better. It was never about age. It was about access. The door was always there. You just believed it would hurt more people to open it than to keep standing in front of it. Now it's open. And no one is stopping you. No one is asking you to explain. No one is clapping either. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like air. Unfiltered. Unsweetened. Unapplauded. But it's yours. All of it. You are not unfinished. You are unclaimed. And claiming yourself at 60 isn't too late. It's just the first time you don't need the world's approval to belong to yourself. Stay curious. This version of you has never been lived before.